We finally have a look at our first 2024 car of the season, and while it might not be the most exciting team on the grid, it gives us a big idea of what Ferrari is thinking about and a couple of new innovations on this Haas that could maybe potentially bring this car in a different direction. I mean, the team principal over there has already pretty much came out and said that this will be the worst car on the grid, but why not go over the worst car on the grid in our first 2024 car? So this is everything you need to know. Please subscribe if you're new here. It would mean the world for me. We're killing it, and I'm very thankful for you guys. So let's go over the Haas 2024 VF24. I kind of want to work our way up, starting from the frontal image, from the front wing, all the way to the back to the rear wing. But obviously in this image we see both, so I will talk about both and things that I notice. So the front wing to me is pretty similar to what we had last year. We still have the 4 dividers on each side and even one on that lower plane wing. And the actual nose itself is a bit different, but it's still not connected all the way to the bottom. I know all the way to the bottom was kind of an Aston Martin car. The Mercedes also had it as well. It is a different concept to go for, but Red Bull also has it that way as well. So not much really to note, at least on the front nose and the front wing. Pretty much the same, a little bit different in the outwash parts, but nothing huge to really notice. Now, a big thing here for the car that I'm looking at is that it's pushrod still. And some people have theorized that instead of it being pushrod, it's actually a pull rod, but they just wanted to show on the show car that it's a pushrod. I don't really see any reason as to why Haas would be hiding that the car is a pull rod suspension in the front. Now, my only thinking here is that Ferrari wants to hide that it's a pull rod suspension because there were a lot of reports coming out that this car did have a different suspension. And I'll tell you this, the actual benefits from pushrod to pull rod are very minimal, but Adrian Newey has figured something out, so a lot of people are like, oh, we gotta go for it. So push rod, pull rod, whatever the suspension is, it can still work. It's just dependent on what you do with it, how much anti-dive you add, anti-squat. That's all dependent on the team and how you want to drive out those cars. Now, I've been thinking the issue with this car has been within that suspension somewhere, but they say it's an aero deficiency that as to why their tires have been performing so badly. So push rod suspension still for the Haas car, but big thing you can notice just looking here, if you look at that engine intake that for the engine cover, different. They don't have the V shape. It's still there prominently, but they added a little bit more of a circular shape to it, to the top of the car, to provide more engine cooling. That's going to be a big thing on this car that I want to talk about as we get into more different views on this car. From the front, you can also notice that the actual side pod inlets are pretty Aston Martin-like. I think they look identical to the AMR 23. I know a lot of people are going to bring up, oh, but it's very much like the RB19 because it's got that cutout in the front. Yes, from the side, it does. But if you're looking at it frontally, very similar to the AMR 23. And I mean, the way that that undercut goes in, the dip in it, kind of how it pushes out to the side a little bit too. To me, this car pretty much looks like an AMR 23 reskinned. And while I put them side by side, you're going to see what I'm talking about. A very, very similar car all the way to the back of the rear wing. It's very, very closely looking like the AMR 23. Now, looking at this view, the thumbnail view for this car, biggest things you can notice is that the side pod is completely different to even what they had on their B spec. Now, the look of this car with this kind of whole entire black carbon, just to mention the looks real fast, I do love carbon fiber. I think it's so slick. But when it's on a Formula 1 car to this level, I find it way less slick. And I'm not a fan of the cars being so carbonized out. But speaking of that side pod, you don't see a little indent like you saw with the past Haas because they changed their side impact structure to the bottom of the floor, giving it that little bump in the floor. This is a big thing because we know the AMR has it, the Red Bull has it, the McLaren has it. Mercedes is probably going to change that as well. I mean, almost every team on the grid did have it with the exception of Haas, Ferrari, and I'm pretty sure Mercedes was the only teams that didn't have this chassis setup. But now that is changed to give it that more undercutty look. But this undercut isn't Red Bull-esque. It's very Aston Martin-esque. It's not a huge undercut, but it is there. Straight up, this car is very, very close to the AMR 23, which is a very good car to go off of if you want to improve down those fields. I mean, there's only a couple of slight changes from that AMR 23 that kind of make it that Haas car, but this is pretty much to me a reskinned AMR 23. And the floor from this view is very simple. It's going to stay simple because this is where teams hide most of the work that's been done on the car. So yes, the side impact structure is there because it has to be, but The actual floor and the outskirts of the floor, you're not going to see much change there, only because it is a show car at the moment. That is their actual car they're going to run without the floor and the whole downforce points and everything. So I wouldn't really look too much into that as to what they have right now. The simplicity, it's there, but obviously it's going to change up a lot more. Another big thing to notice, and something that I realized from this view, is that the actual engine cover over there, super Red Bull-esque from this side. They have a little vein going down from that side pod onto the engine cover in between it. That is super Red Bull-esque, and at some point there was a theory that the actual air going from the side pod going into that engine cover was giving Red Bull a lot of performance. I do think that is something that Haas is trying to replicate. They were a car with a pretty strong rear end, but their front end wasn't as good as it could have been for the car that they've been having. But the rear end was super strong and they had really good DRS, but it's the tires that really kill them. Hence why I call it the butter shredder. So will this be the 3.0? We still have yet to see. Now, looking at it from a top view, this view is very interesting because we get to see that there is no slide pod mechanism to this car anymore. And I kind of figured this would be the case. They are very Red Bull-esque. And now when you look at the side pods, even the way that they've done that inlet is more Aston Martin-like than it is Red Bull-like. Telling you, I think that's what they took inspiration of, was the AMR23. Now, obviously, the slide pods were AMR23, but this is very more Red Bull-esque, very simple in the side pods, but it has that now downwashing system. They were struggling, and their engine cover was a big issue, in my opinion, with the B-spec of the car. And I know now that they're talking about that this car will be more oversteery, which is more to the style of Kevin Magnussen. He really likes that. They've known him for longer, and the team principal over there has known Kevin for a longer time. I wonder if the car is going more into that direction. But as you can also see, the engine cooling is in where most people have it. Those cooling gills are actually on top of the engine cover where most people have had it. But very, I would say simple, and there's not much of it because the rear of the car shows you that a lot of the cooling is going through those side pods, hence why they have that big undercut in the side pod to have more air come in and go out towards the back to actually cool off the engine. They're not focusing as much because last year, and I'll pull up the picture, oh my goodness, when they were in Mexico, the cooling gills in that car must have slowed that car down by like 3 seconds, literally just because of the cooling. Pretty Haas-like picture, but yes, they have been struggling with cooling for a very long period of time. But all this shows is the downwash going into the rear of the car, and in the rear, you can see that their rear suspension is still that pull rod suspension. As I said, it's difficult to say if Ferrari really has changed up their rear and front suspension because it would have made sense that Haas would have done that because they pick up Ferrari parts. So it tells us that I don't think Ferrari has actually changed that, but the side impact structure, that is obviously a big thing. And from this side view, you can tell that the actual bib tray itself is still the same. It's that double T tray, very closely aligned to the AMR23. Yet again, they have that cutout in the rear wing, which I expected this to be the case for Haas. They're one of the only teams that didn't run that cutout. And here you can see an even better picture of what I was talking about, the whole entire engine cover, the heat from the side pod going out towards the back of the car into the beam wing. And the beam wing was revised. The beam wing was made very Red Bull-esque. It was bigger than usual. And the actual edge of the fence itself has changed as well. As I said for the floor, it's going to be simple, but as I said, you can also see that redesigned outer floor fence that is very reminiscent of the RB19. That's kind of one of the only parts on the floor that we can actually tell. Yes, they have that little in-wash part for going from the side pod into the rear of the car. Every car has that. It only makes sense why cut off the actual floor going into the back. And the last part that I wanted to actually talk about with the Haas car is that the fin on the car, they used to always have that little cutout in between to actually give you a little bit more engine cooling. They finally changed that and they went with one that's pretty popular on the grid. It's, I would say, very closely aligned to either the Aston Martin or the Red Bull, whatever you'd like to say. That is everything that I have. The Halo winglets are the same, but the actual Haas car has changed a pretty decent amount, but is this enough to take them anywhere? I don't really know. My expectations for this VF24 are very low, but the ideas that the team principal is coming up with, I like where he's talking. He's talking more of a point that the in-season development will be huge for them, unlike other seasons. So I'd love to see that change. Let me know your thoughts down below on this new Haas VF24. So excited. This is everything you need to know, coming out for every single car, obviously. So please leave a like, subscribe, it'd mean the world, and peace.